Penguin Random House Audio presents The Secret Token, Myth, Obsession, and the Search for the Lost Colony of Roanoke by Andrew Lawler. Read for you by David H. Lawrence, the 17th. Forbear. Prelude. On August 15th, 1590, two English ships, the Moonlight and the Hopewell, dropped anchor off the outer banks of North Carolina. Beyond the slender strip of sand and dense forest, a hazy sun descended over the Pamlico Sound, its calm waters seeming to stretch as far to the west as the Atlantic did to the east. Gripping the rail of the Hopewell, as the ship rose and fell on the gentle ocean swells, Governor John White watched with growing elation as a great plume of smoke climbed into the sticky air of the late afternoon sky. The source of the fire was Roanoke Island, which lay a dozen miles to the northwest in the shallow sound. The signal put us in good hope that some of the colony were there expecting my return out of England, he recalled later. White had left more than 100 settlers there, including his only child and her newly born daughter, before embarking on a 6-month mission to gather supplies and new colonists. Those 6 months had become 3 nightmarish years, comprising a series of mishaps that would have tested Job. Until spotting the smoke, the middle-aged Londoner had had no way of knowing what had become of his settlers, who made up the first English colony in the New World, which Walter Raleigh, an influential knight in Queen Elizabeth I's court, had appointed him to lead. They might have died from disease or starvation or fallen victim to Spanish or Native American enemies. They could have moved to another location or, in desperation, tried to sail back to England in their small boats, only to drown. The rising column seemed a sure sign that the colonists had spotted his ship. He anticipated a happy homecoming. The governor had already made at least 2 round-trip journeys to the land that the people who lived there called Osamokamak, and that the newcomers dubbed Virginia, after their unmarried queen. His return to England in 1587, after landing the colonists at Roanoke, had proved an ordeal. Illness and hunger killed many of his crew on the stormy trip east. Only by luck did the ship drift into an Irish harbor. Just weeks before he reached London to organize the resupply effort, Elizabeth I had forbidden any vessel to leave the kingdom without royal permission. Word had just reached the Queen that her one-time beau, and now bitter foe, the Spanish king, Philip II, intended to launch a vast armada to invade the country and remove the heretic Protestant monarch from her throne. When White did manage to charter a ship to carry supplies and settlers to Virginia the following spring in a military convoy, unfavorable winds delayed the fleet that was then diverted instead to protect the home coast. Undaunted, he found a privateer, a government-sanctioned pirate, heading for the Caribbean Sea and willing to stop by Virginia on the way back, but he never made it across the Atlantic. French pirates attacked the ship and wounded the governor in a fierce and bloody deck fight off the coast of Morocco. He was lucky to make it back to England alive, with a laceration to his head and lead in his buttocks. 2 more excruciating years passed as the armada arrived and was defeated, but the country remained on a war footing, with little time to bother about abandoned colonists in a faraway land. The best White could do was obtain a single berth on a vessel that joined a convoy to rob Spanish ships in the Caribbean Sea. After a long, hot summer patrolling for plunder, White's ship, the Hopewell, accompanied by the Moonlight, glided on the Gulf Stream, the warm current that carried them north, between Florida and the Bahamas, past the Spanish towns of St. Augustine and Santa Elena that marked the edge of the Spanish Empire, and up the coast to the narrow barrier islands called the Outer Banks. As the land he had departed 3 years prior came into view, his tribulations finally seemed over. White didn't know. They had only begun. The next morning, the governor and the 2 ships' captains climbed into 2 smaller boats to row through the narrow inlet between the barrier islands that would take them from the ocean into the Pamlico, and from there to the place at Roanoke where our countrymen were left. As they pushed off, the master gunner fired 3 cannon, with a reasonable space between every shot, to the end that their reports might be heard to the place where we hoped to find some of our people. The ship's guns boomed in the pallid summer sky as the sailors leaned on their oars. Halfway into their journey, another smoke plume blossomed a few miles to the south, along the long, thin island called Hatteras that separated the Atlantic and the Pamlico. Because this signal seemed a direct response to the artillery barrage, White and the captains changed course to investigate. The crew pulled the boats up on the marshy western shore of the island, and the men set off on foot to find the bonfire's source. Distances in the flat landscape of sea and sand proved deceiving. It was much further from the harbor where we landed than we supposed it to be, so that we were sore tired before we came to the smoke, White recounts. When they finally found the spot, we found no man nor sign any had been there lately. There was also no fresh water. By the time the men returned to the boats, after a long midday summer trek without provisions, they were exhausted and desperately thirsty. Digging into the sand beside the shore, a trick White had learned on a previous visit, they were able to procure a drink. The sun had already set into the Pamlico by the time they made their way back through the inlet and climbed back aboard the ships. The governor spent another restless night just shy of his goal. A boat was sent ashore early the next morning to collect more fresh water, and it was 10 in the morning before White could launch a second attempt to reach Roanoke. By now, the ocean had turned rough. The governor set off again with the captain of the Hopewell. As they neared the inlet into the Pamlico, we had a sea break into our boat, which filled us half with water, White reports. The soaked crew landed safely on the Hatteras shore, though all their provisions were spoiled, and the gunpowder wet. Worse was to follow. As the men made it to land, the wind blew at northeast and direct into the harbor so great a gale that the sea broke extremely on the bar, and the tide went very forcibly at the entrance. The surge caught the second boat carrying a crew from the moonlight just as it entered the inlet. The men on the beach watched helplessly as a wave overturned the vessel on a submerged sandbar, tossing the sailors into the foaming water. The surf pounded those who clung to the gunwales. Some tried to wade to safety, but the water beat them down so that they could neither stand nor swim, and the boat twice or thrice was turned the keel upward. White watched helplessly as the captain and master's mate of the Moonlight clutched the boat until they sunk and were seen no more. Several of the crew members of the first boat stripped and dashed into the treacherous seas, but were able to rescue only 4 of the 11. The mischance did so much discomfort the sailors that they were all of one mind not to go any further to seek the planters, according to the governor. Only an impassioned plea by White and the stern command of the Hopewell captain persuaded the men to continue the quest. The sun was low by the time the 2 boats could be readied and provisioned anew, but White couldn't bear to wait another night. The expedition set off across the Pamlico Sound toward Roanoke. Before we could get to the place where our planters were left, it was so exceeding dark that we overshot the place 1/4 of a mile, he reports. As they cruised along the island's north end, the men saw the light of a great fire through the woods, to which we presently rode. It seemed another sign the colonists were awaiting White's return. The men, still shaken from the tragedy earlier in the day, dropped anchor close to the conflagration, but decided against landing in the dark. Instead, they sounded a trumpet, and
Sample complete. Ready to continue?